In this lecture module, we're going to pivot from talking about arguments to talking about two specific arguments offered up in support of a particular doctrine and Rachel's evaluation of each of those arguments. Now, unfortunately, I realize this might be a little confusing, but Rachel's talks about this doctrine and names it moral skepticism. However, the doctrine is actually moral nihilism. What's the difference here? Well, strictly speaking, a moral skeptic will deny that we can know moral truths. It's a skeptical position. It's a position that we cannot know something. So the moral skeptic denies that we know moral truths. But people often, and Rachel's does in this chapter, conflate that view, moral skepticism, the denial that we can know moral truths, with a closely related position, moral nihilism. Now, moral nihilists deny that there are any objective moral truths at all. So, moral nihilists are making a claim about whether or not there are truths. Moral skeptics are making a claim about whether or not we can know those truths. So let's go ahead now and look at the provability argument. It's the second argument Rachel's considers, but I'm going to look at it first because I think it's a little easier to understand evaluating an argument's premises as being true or false and the argument as being sound or unsound, as opposed to evaluating logical form. So what does the provability argument do? It starts with this premise. If there are any such things as objective truths in ethics, we should be able to prove that some moral opinions are true and others are false. In fact, we cannot prove which moral opinions are true and which are false. Therefore, there is no such thing as objective truth in ethics. Okay, so our conclusion, moral nihilism, our first two premises taken to be clearly and obviously true. But Rachel's wants to evaluate this argument, and when he does, he looks at that second premise and says, wait a minute, that premise isn't actually true. This argument is unsound. It does not have all true premises. So he challenges that second premise, and he says, look, this idea that we can't prove any moral opinions true or false, that's just false. And he gives us two considerations that he thinks undermine or belie that second premise. First, while consensus regarding solutions to difficult moral issues, like to all difficult problems, seems much more elusive, many moral opinions are easily proven and disproven. So, pedophiles are morally bad people. That seems like a pretty easy to establish conclusion. Dictators are bad people. Lying for one's own benefit is wrong. Defrauding innocent seniors is wrong. It seems like there are lots of things that aren't particularly difficult for us to establish in the moral realm. Now, the second thing that Rachel's noticed is that even when we have cases where there isn't a consensus as to what the correct evaluation is, moral, immoral, correct, incorrect, true, false, that doesn't mean that there isn't an actual acceptable solution. Rachel suggested in these cases it's just difficult to figure out exactly what the solution is. So Rachel feels like we have good reason to suppose that second premise is false, and hence the provability argument is unsound. This doesn't establish that moral nihilism is false. It only establishes that the provability argument doesn't give us good reasons to suppose that moral nihilism is true. Let's now turn our attention to the cultural differences argument. The cultural differences argument again tries to establish that moral nihilism, but it does so in a slightly different way. The first premise, in some societies, such as among the indigenous inhabitants of the circumpolar areas of North America and the northeastern tip of Siberia, infanticide is thought to be morally acceptable. This isn't true now, but it did used to be the case. In other societies, such as our own, infanticide is thought to be morally odious. Therefore, infanticide is neither objectively right nor objectively wrong. It is merely a matter of opinion that varies from culture to culture. So the underlying argumentative strategy of the cultural differences argument is pretty straightforward. We can find some issues where there is significant disagreement, at least at some point in time, among cultures as to the moral status of some activity. since we can find those cases, it must not be the case that any moral truths exist, because if they did, we wouldn't find these divergences. Now, Rachel criticizes this argument by saying that the argument is invalid. Even if its premises are true, it doesn't establish that its conclusion also has to be true. And how does he do that? Well, he's going to challenge the inferential claim of the argument. If the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. He's going to claim that it's possible for the premises to be true without guaranteeing that the conclusion is true. And specifically, one of the things he's going to note is that individuals or groups having different or contradictory beliefs in and of itself doesn't guarantee that there's no matter of fact out there. And he'll emphasize this criticism by generating a counterexample, a version of the cultural differences argument where the premises are true, obviously true, the conclusion obviously false. And that will illustrate that it's possible for the premises to be true without guaranteeing that the conclusion is true. So what is that counterexample? In some societies, the world is thought to be flat. This is true, though not as prevalent as people thought it was. In other societies, the world is thought to be round. So here we have a disagreement about the shape of the earth. Therefore, objectively speaking, the world is neither flat nor round. It is merely a matter of opinion that varies from culture to culture. These first two premises being true doesn't seem to guarantee that the conclusion is true. There's a fact about the shape of the earth, and one society is wrong, the other society, well, is approximately right. The world's not perfectly round. Again, by showing that the cultural differences argument is invalid, Rachel doesn't demonstrate that moral nihilism is false. He only demonstrates that the cultural differences argument as presented doesn't give us a good reason to believe in moral nihilism. So this concludes the lecture on this chapter. However, I would encourage you to go through and look at that original page. See if you can reconstruct the lecture. Make sure that you understand the relationships between each of the points and, of course, each of the points themselves. Rehearse it one more time before you move on to something else, and that will help to reinforce it and help you to remember it.